Hi, this is History with Andrew Allen, and this is my series, The Emergence of Europe, the Fall of the Roman Empire, the Rise of the Franks, and the Creation of Charlemagne's Empire. Today is episode 12, Nika. Before I forget, I include the names of the people I talk about and my sources in the description. As I explained last episode, Clovis's 4 sons agreed to divide the Frankish kingdom between them and expand outwards rather than fight each other. In theory, their expansion would have been blocked by the combined Gothic kingdom of Hispania and Italy, but Theodoric's succession plan fell apart when his son-in-law Eutharic died. Theodoric died several years later and was succeeded by his grandsons in Hispania and Italy. Unsurprisingly, the Visigoth kingdom in Hispania separated peacefully from the Ostrogoth kingdom in Italy. Once the Grand Gothic kingdom broke apart, the Ostrogoths were too weak to block the Franks' expansion. As a result, the 4 Frankish kingdoms conquered first the Thuringians and then most of Burgundy, although one of the brothers died in the fighting. In fact, the Ostrogoths did not aid the Visigoths against a Frankish invasion. Obviously, the Franks' next target was Italy, but the situation changed when the Eastern Empire made an attempt to retake the former Western Roman Empire. So, what has been happening in the Eastern Roman Empire since Theodoric conquered Italy? Anastasius did not have any children of his own when he became emperor in 491. Since he married Ariadne, the widow of his predecessor Zeno, to strengthen his legitimacy, it would have been natural to produce an heir, but she was roughly 40 and he was 20 years older in a time before in vitro fertilization. This is even presuming that they had carnal relations. Anyway, we know that Ariadne never became pregnant, so Anastasius prepared his nephews to succeed him. Actually, there was no guarantee that he would be able to name his successor since he had essentially been a compromise candidate, chosen partially because he was well into middle age and had no powerful personal network behind him. While 2 of his nephews received high military commands, they were kept away from Constantinople, as if to make sure that they would be unable to play a role in the succession when the emperor finally died. As a result, there was no clear successor when Anastasius died in his sleep on July 9th, 518. So, who would choose a new emperor if there was no official successor? The people, of course. It was customary for the crowd in the Hippodrome to shout out what it wanted, although the racing factions could be bribed to ensure that the crowd shouted what an emperor wanted to hear. I need to quickly explain the racing factions. Chariot racing was the dominant spectator sport of the time, and there were 4 main teams: the Greens, the Blues, the Reds, and the Whites, although the Greens and the Blues were the most popular. Champion chariot racers were celebrities, and each team had its own fanatical supporters. By this time, the fan clubs had become violent groups that represented criminal networks. Obviously, the Blues and the Greens could be relied on to ensure that the crowd shouted the correct name after receiving sufficient financial reward. Again, there are no tell-all memoirs to reveal the factional infighting that resulted in Justinian becoming emperor. However, there are some basic facts. When the crowd assembled in the Hippodrome, previous negotiation with the factions ensured that the crowd shouted that it wanted a general. Great, but there were 2 generals. Justin, commander of the palace guard, and Patricius, commander of the central field army, and obviously unfamiliar to the crowd. Determined to spare Patricius embarrassment, Justin kindly helped him leave the stage, or dragged him out depending on your perspective. Honestly, the most likely explanation is that Justin's position as palace commander ensured that he knew the emperor's health situation and could meet with the racing factions to bribe them to arrange for the crowd to shout what he wanted. Undoubtedly, other groups had similar schemes, he just moved faster. Anyway, Justin was another 60-year-old childless compromise candidate. To many people's surprise, Justin proved to be an aggressive emperor. Since he had been based in the palace, he knew how it worked. Potential rivals were executed or fired, and many of their replacements were people who wanted to end the schism with Rome, so he soon sent messages to the Pope asking him to send envoys. The cause of the schism was widespread opposition to the Council of Chalcedon, which had stated that Jesus of Nazareth was both human and divine. As emperor, Justin did not see any need for tolerance of different religious interpretations, so Roughly 30 bishops who opposed Chalcedon were removed from their diocese. As ever with emperors, it is impossible to separate genuine belief from ruthless execution of power. Justin does not seem to have been concerned with religious belief within the empire, just whether or not the various institutions submitted to his authority. In particular, Justin would tolerate no rivals either to him or his chosen heir, his nephew Justinian. When a popular general was sadly murdered by unknown assailants, his position was given to Justinian. By coincidence, Hypatius, the favorite nephew of the previous emperor Anastasius, was returned to his former position as commander of the Eastern Front around the same time. It is hard to avoid the interpretation that Justin had made an arrangement with one faction in order to move against another faction while making his nephew the likely heir. In fact, Justin was clearly determined to support his nephew, since a year later he changed the law barring legitimate marriages between individuals of high rank and people of lower social status, such as actresses. Conveniently, Justinian had fallen deeply in love with a former actress named Theodora. Actually, the affair itself was not a problem. The problem was his refusal to simply keep Theodora as a mistress and make a loveless marriage that would produce legitimate heirs. The law was changed to permit women with that status to petition the emperor to accept that they had never sinned. It is unlikely that many actresses would have their petitions heard by the emperor, but Theodora's was, so their children would now be legitimate. The law existed because the great landowning families wanted to ensure that people with lower social status could never marry their way into the elite, so Justin had risked angering that elite just to satisfy his nephew. There is no indication that Justin wanted to transform society. He simply did his nephew a favor. A really, really, really big favor. Finally, to no one's surprise, Justin made his nephew Justinian his official heir. In April 527, the empire released a new gold coin. Obviously, Justin was on one side of the coin, but he was accompanied by his nephew, who had been acclaimed co-emperor. By this time, Justin was too ill to appear in public, and he died later that year on August 1st. Clearly, the succession had been planned, and Justinian smoothly succeeded his uncle. The timing is interesting. Justinian became emperor roughly a year after Theodoric died. Would Justinian take advantage of the succession issues within the Ostrogoth kingdom to reclaim Italy? Undoubtedly, Justinian had read reports of the instability in Italy, Gaul, and Hispania and saw an opportunity. However, Justinian would have to first deal with the consequences of his uncle's policies, namely religious resentment in the empire, and the increasing likelihood of a war with the Persians. Speaking of the Persians, tensions had been building between the empire and the Persians, so Justinian naturally continued the destruction of defensive fortifications that had begun near the end of his uncle's reign. However, he also increased the likelihood of war when he interfered with the buffer zone in Armenia. The Romans had contracted defense in the region to local lords who had their own private armies. Basically, they were independent military contractors who enjoyed a good working relationship with the Eastern Roman Empire. As a result, the Persians could tell themselves that Armenia remained a buffer region, at least until Justinian formalized Roman rule over the region, replacing autonomous local armies with Roman garrisons and integrating the Armenian provinces into the empire. This integration included Roman forts, roads to supply the forts, and Christian churches, even though the region was not Christian. In fact, Justinian attempted to force the locals to convert to Christianity. Along with other aggressive policies in Syria and the southern region to strengthen the Roman positions, Justinian was undeniably preparing for a war. So, the Persians attacked first. In June 530, a Persian army advanced on Dara, where they faced a Roman army led by a young general named Belisarius. The Persians lost the battle, and fighting the following year mostly favored the Romans, who had the advantage of strong forts in the region. When the elderly Shah died later that year, his son Khusro began negotiations with Justinian, which produced a treaty called the Endless Peace in late 532. The treaty was portrayed in the Senate as a humiliation because Justinian agreed to pay large sums to the Persians, although he kept all of his territory, including the fortifications. The money was intended to fund the Persian defenses in the mountain passes called the Caspian Gates, which blocked the steppe nomads from raiding in the Caucasus, which benefited both empires. Also, the new Shah had to show the powerful noble families in his court that he had gained something from the treaty. Still, senators grumbling about their taxes being used to pay Persian soldiers was just grumbling, not dangerous. However, Justinian provoked religious resentment. Justinian passed an astonishing number of laws soon after he became emperor, and many of them dealt with morality. In particular, he passed laws against pagans. At first glance, he was merely reinforcing laws passed by previous emperors, but it soon became clear that he intended to enforce these laws. It is difficult to know the full extent of pagan belief in the empire at the time, since pagans, noble or poor, kept their beliefs private in Constantinople. However, pagan worship was conducted openly in more distant regions such as Lebanon and Asia Minor, where there were few Christian churches. Rather than waste energy on conversion, Justinian passed a law in 529 that made it illegal to perform pagan rites and even to be a pagan. People who failed to convert would be exiled, while performance of pagan rituals could be punished with execution. It would have been impossible to police poor farmers across the empire, but Justinian appears to have been concerned with the upper class. This aggressive moral campaign was not received well. It needs to be stressed, his rule would naturally be opposed by rival factions who had lost out on the best positions and patronage, but the oppressive investigation into the beliefs of his subjects was viewed as a major overstep. Previous emperors had been content with public conformity and did not inquire closely whether or not people followed pagan practices in the privacy of their own homes. However, Justinian had broken with that tradition, which naturally fueled resentment. Still, this resentment would have remained resentment except Justinian raised taxes. Would people complain about taxes if they received better roads and food during famines? No, but roughly half of the taxes went to the army, so people complained. Why did Justinian need to dramatically raise taxes? Several decades of peaceful coexistence with the Persians and no major barbarian invasions meant that the tax burden had been relatively light. However, once Justinian began his military expansion, he needed more tax revenue, so his officials were ordered to employ more strict methods to squeeze more money. As a result, he found an extremely efficient bureaucrat named John the Cappadocian and promoted him to chief finance minister. John performed his job well and tax revenue increased, but so did resentment in the provinces. Worse, around the same time, Greek replaced Latin as the language for legislation. This was a logical change and likely long overdue, but it added to the long list of unwelcome changes that people had to accept. Undoubtedly, many complaints by wealthy landowners could be ignored, but the social pressures were building. So, how did people communicate their complaints to the emperor? In theory, through the Senate, specifically the branch of the Senate that had been established in Constantinople. But Justinian did not appear to care about the opinions of senators. Okay, what about the circus factions? Initially, emperors had relied on the support of factions, but Justinian had made a determined effort to free himself from dependence on any faction. In fact, his new legal code made it clear that he wanted to rule as an emperor. The worthless voice of the people should not be listened to. The decision to ignore the circus factions meant more than one would think at first glance. Despite their origins as thuggish hooligans, the interactions between the emperor and the factions in the Hippodrome had been carefully planned, stage-managed exchanges. At best, the exchanges ensured that the emperor had an idea of public opinion, and at the least, people had the illusion that the emperor listened to them. It is important to stress that the decision to break the power of the circus factions made sense, as long as the emperor replaced them with another channel of communication with the general population. But he simply focused on breaking the factions. So, numerous members of both the blue and the green factions were arrested on January 10th, 532, and 7 were sentenced to death. The sources are unclear, but the hanging was badly done, and one member of each faction survived, escaping to the sanctuary of a nearby church. Ordinarily, the situation could be ignored, but Justinian had to preside over the start of a new series of races at the Hippodrome several days later. Naturally, the two factions set aside their rivalry and publicly called for the freedom of their members in the church. When Justinian simply ignored them, the crowd grew angry and rioted. The riots are called the Nika riots because the crowd would shout Nika, which meant conquer, during races. Since the riots continued the next day, even though the murderers had already been freed by the rioters, Justinian sent a representative to ask what the rioters wanted. The answer was the dismissal of John the Cappadocian and another key official, which was a signal that the factions were working with the dissatisfied members of the Senate and the bureaucracy. The Nika riots spiraled out of control astonishingly quickly. The crowd at the Hippodrome asked the emperor to pardon several prisoners from the factions on a Tuesday, and by Saturday the crowd had acclaimed Hypatius emperor. According to later accounts, Theodora shamed Justinian into resisting the rioters, but it seems likely that the emperor was planning something. His commanders certainly were, since Belisarius had arrived with troops from the Persian front. A general named Narses entered the Hippodrome and bribed the Blues to leave, and the thugs of the Greens were no match for armored troops. Despite protestations of loyalty, Hypatius and his brother Pompeius were executed and their property was returned to the empire. Actually, it is unclear if Hypatius had really attempted a coup against Justinian. The situation was strange since Hypatius and Pompeius were evicted from the palace where they had sensibly sought shelter. It is almost as if Justinian had manipulated a rival into openly opposing the emperor. Anyway, Justinian had won and had even ensured that his consort received public praise for her strength of character. The brutal restoration of order had succeeded, but at the cost of the deaths of roughly 5% of the population and the destruction of much of the city. The aristocrats had avoided the massacre in the Hippodrome, but Justinian was determined to eliminate their threat. 19 senators were executed, and the rest were harassed by Justinian's chief tax collector, John the Cappadocian. The great landowning families never really recovered their full power, which unintentionally led to more social mobility, as poor people could rise through the imperial bureaucracy. Still, Justinian could feel comfortable as he sat on his throne, even though much of the city was in ruins. So, would Justinian focus on rebuilding the city, or would he adopt a more ambitious strategy? To sum up, when Emperor Anastasius died without a clear successor, Justin, the commander of the palace guard, gained enough support from the influential racing factions to become emperor. While he had been a compromise candidate, Justin was able to ensure the smooth succession of his nephew Justinian. Although he became emperor roughly a year after Theodoric died, Justinian soon became preoccupied with the Persian War and riots in the capital. The war was quickly resolved, but the riots proved to be genuinely dangerous. Tired of the racing factions interfering in politics, Justinian had cracked down on the hooligans, which had provoked a major riot. It appeared that Justinian might be forced to abdicate, but loyal troops had arrived in the capital and massacred the rioters while they were gathered in the Hippodrome. The riots were used as an excuse to eliminate any rivals for the throne, leaving Justinian in firm control of the Eastern Roman Empire. I will explain what he did with that power next episode. Thanks for listening. If you liked the episode and want to support me, I include a link to my Patreon in the description, or you can buy me a coffee.